The winter fog of post-war Berlin did not simply drift through the boulevards. It clung to the stone facades like damp wool, smelling of soft coal, horse manure, and the faint, sweet rot of a metropolis starved into submission. In the opening months of 1921, the German capital was a city suspended between an unbearable past and an unstable future. 4 years of slaughter in the trenches of the Western Front had been followed without pause by the devastating sweep of the Spanish influenza, leaving behind an entire generation of empty rooms, black crepe mourning veils, and a population whose collective grief had curdled into a desperate, almost pathological longing for the impossible. In the tea rooms of Charlottenburg and the smoky cabarets of the Friedrichstrasse, spiritualists and occultists rubbed shoulders with physicists and battlefield surgeons. Death was everywhere, yet the living refused to accept its finality. It was in this fertile soil of national bereavement that Dr. Friedrich Becker found his calling, transforming the clinical observations of the triage tent into a radical crusade against the very boundary of human mortality. Becker was not an uneducated mystic or a carnival trickster. He was a fully credentialed product of the rigorous Prussian medical establishment. Trained in pathology and internal medicine, he had spent the final, blood-soaked years of the Great War serving in field clearing stations along the Meuse. There, amid the thunder of artillery and the endless supply of shattered bodies, he had developed an obsession with the precise moment of transition, that ephemeral, poorly understood borderland where the pulse ceases, the pupils dilate, but the tissues remain warm and pliable. While other physicians turned away to attend to the living, Becker had lingered over the newly dead, experimenting with direct intracardiac injections of adrenaline, novel camphor derivatives, and crude electrical currents drawn from field telegraph batteries. He had seen hearts flutter back into rhythm after minutes of total silence. He had seen limbs twitch and lungs take involuntary, shuddering gasps long after the spirit was presumed to have departed. To Becker, the cessation of a heartbeat was not a definitive full stop, but merely a mechanical failure that modern chemistry had not yet learned to correct. When he returned to civilian practice in Berlin, the doctor found himself alienated from the orthodox medical community. While his colleagues at the Charité hospital occupied themselves with treating chronic ailments and patching up the maimed veterans who lined the curbs of the Unter den Linden, Becker spent his nights in a rented laboratory behind an abattoir in Moabit. The space reeked of carbolic acid, formalin, and ozone. Surrounded by zinc-topped dissection tables, mercury manometers, and towering glass batteries filled with sulfuric acid, Becker worked with frantic, exhausting intensity. His subjects were canine and feline corpses procured from city kennels, which he subjected to controlled anoxia before attempting resuscitation using complex perfusion solutions of oxygenated saline, potassium salts, and concentrated adrenal extracts. Time and again, he succeeded in restoring rhythmic contractions to isolated mammalian hearts suspended in glass chambers, keeping them pulsing for hours after their hosts had been legally and biologically dead. To his mind, the human medical establishment was blind, shackled by antiquated religious dogmas and an irrational fear of the dark. Biological death, Becker reasoned in his meticulously kept leather-bound journals, was not a sudden catastrophe that extinguished cellular life all at once. It was a gradual, cascading chemical inertia. If one could flush the toxic metabolic byproducts from the vascular tree, supply oxygen directly to the cerebral cortex via specialized perfusions, and deliver a synchronous galvanic shock to the sinoatrial node before irreversible autolysis set in, there was no theoretical reason why a human being could not be pulled back from the void. By February of 1921, Dr. Becker decided he would no longer hide his work behind the closed doors of a rented abattoir backroom. He hired a public hall in the center of Berlin and delivered a lecture that sent shockwaves through both the medical establishment and the general public. Standing before a packed auditorium of physicians, university students, and weeping widows in black lace, Becker presented his grand thesis with cold, unshakable authority. He declared that clinical death the moment a doctor signs a certificate upon finding no pulse or breath was merely a temporary chemical stasis. He asserted publicly that this stasis could be completely reversed within a window of 36 hours, provided the physical organs remained structurally intact and the brain had been preserved from total cellular decay. The reaction was instantaneous and polarized. The elders of the Berlin Medical Society condemned him furiously, branding his claims as blasphemous pseudoscience, dangerous charlatanism, and an insult to the memory of the dead. Leading neurologists published scathing rebuttals in the medical journals, pointing out that cerebral cells starved of oxygen suffer permanent, irreversible destruction within minutes, not days. But among the general populace, Becker's words landed with the force of a religious revelation. In a nation where almost every household had lost a father, a son, or a daughter, the prospect of reversing death offered a narcotic solace. Within days of the lecture, desperate citizens were gathering outside Becker's private residence, clutching photographs of deceased loved ones, begging for an audience, and offering their life savings for a miracle. Managing this overwhelming swell of grief and interest was Becker's wife, Maria. A former nurse who had met Friedrich during the war, Maria was a woman of sharp intellect, quiet composure, and absolute devotion to her husband's vision. While Friedrich was consumed by the physiological mechanics of galvanic currents, cannula diameters, and perfusion chemistry, Maria recognized the logistical and financial reality of their situation. Mainstream academic institutions had barred Becker from their facilities. The state medical board was already beginning to monitor his public statements, and their private savings were virtually exhausted from purchasing expensive laboratory apparatus, platinum electrodes, and imported chemical reagents. Sitting at a heavy oak roll-top desk in their apartment, Maria methodically sifted through the mountains of mail that arrived each morning. She developed a clandestine system of correspondence, deliberately ignoring the letters from penniless working-class families and focusing exclusively on the missives penned on heavy, crested parchment. These came from the grieving elite of Weimar society. Industrial barons whose only heirs had died of influenza, old Prussian aristocrats unwilling to accept the extinction of their family lines, and wealthy merchants whose children had succumbed to sudden illnesses. Maria replied to these patrons with carefully measured discretion, offering private consultations and hinting that the doctor was preparing for the ultimate realization of his theories, provided sufficient capital could be secured to build a facility capable of housing such groundbreaking work. The money flowed in with astonishing speed. Grieving families, paralyzed by loss and desperate for any shred of hope that modern science might outwit the grave, handed over vast sums in cash, bonds, and family heirlooms. With their coffers overflowing and the hostility of the Berlin medical authorities growing sharper by the day, the Beckers realized they could no longer remain within the city center. They needed absolute privacy, total autonomy, and a fortress where Friedrich could assemble his machinery and conduct his final, monumental experiment away from the prying eyes of the police and the medical board. In the late spring of 1921, as the horse chestnut trees along the Havel began to bloom, Dr. Becker secured the lease on an isolated estate situated deep within the pine woodlands several miles outside the western perimeter of Berlin. The property, known locally as the Waldhaus, was an imposing, late 19th-century brick manor surrounded by overgrown parkland, a decaying decorative moat, and high, rusted wrought iron fences that shielded it entirely from the public road. It was secluded, damp, and utterly disconnected from the rhythm of the city. Within days of taking possession, Becker had the estate sealed off like a military garrison. Heavy timber hoarding was nailed behind the iron gates, opaque curtains were drawn across every window, and a private detachment of discharged soldiers, still wearing their faded trench coats, was hired to patrol the tree-lined boundary day and night, turning away curious locals, journalists, and uninvited visitors. Behind these secured walls, heavy lorries arrived under the cover of night, unloading towering wooden crates marked with the insignias of precision optical works from Jena, electrical manufacturers from Munich, and chemical suppliers from the Rhineland. In the expansive, stone-flagged basement of the manor once used for storing wine and root vegetables, Becker constructed his ultimate surgical theater. It was a cathedral of brass, glass, and steel. A massive direct current diesel generator was installed in an adjoining outbuilding, its subterranean thrumming vibrating constantly through the foundation of the house, powering banks of high-output induction coils and heavy glass Leyden jars capable of delivering variable galvanic charges through thick, rubber-insulated copper cables. Along the perimeter of the operating room stood a labyrinth of glass perfusion columns, rubber tubing networks, and heated water baths designed to regulate the temperature of arterial fluids before they were pumped into the human circulatory system. By late May of 1921, the preparations were complete. Dr. Friedrich Becker had created the world's most advanced and secretive laboratory for biological reanimation. He had the funding, the machinery, the chemical formulas, and an unwavering, obsessive conviction that the boundary of 36 hours could be breached. He was no longer interested in isolated animal hearts or the twitches of severed tissues. The stage was set, the electrical switches were polished, and the doctor waited behind his locked iron gates for the arrival of the first human subject that would prove to a skeptical world that death was nothing more than a temporary pause. As the stifling summer heat settled over the Prussian lowlands in the June of 1921, the pine forest surrounding the Waldhaus grew thick with the smell of damp earth, resin, and the acrid tang of exhaust from the subterranean generator. Behind the spiked iron gates and the boarded timber fences, the secluded manor ceased to be a private sanctuary and transformed into an active, clandestine receiving house for the dead. The first subjects arrived under the cover of the dense woodland darkness. They were transported in unmarked, closed delivery vans or long, horse-drawn hearses stripped of their funerary plumes and black draperies, slipping through the gates with muffled iron rims and extinguished lanterns. Some were acquired through illicit networks that had taken root in the impoverished underbelly of post-war Berlin, bribed morgue attendants from municipal hospitals, destitute gravediggers willing to substitute stones for corpses in pauper pine coffins, and private couriers who operated in the lawless shadows of the Weimar black market. Others arrived by direct, desperate arrangement with families who had exhausted their sanity in the grip of grief. Maria Becker waited at the side entrance of the manor, holding a kerosene lamp that cast long, shivering shadows across the stone pathway. With practiced composure and a chillingly formal tenderness, she received the grieving relatives, guided them into a wood-paneled anteroom, and presented them with exhaustive legal indemnities. In exchange for astronomical sums, the relatives surrendered all rights to the remains, signing documents that bound them to absolute silence and gave Dr. Becker total, unmonitored custody of the deceased. Down in the subterranean surgical theater, the atmosphere was suffocating and heavy with the competing scents of carbolic acid, formaldehyde, warming animal serums, and the sharp, metallic bite of electrical ozone. Friedrich Becker worked without rest, stripping off his wool coat and donning heavy rubber aprons and oilcloth sleeves that were quickly stained with brine and dark, coagulated fluids. His experiments escalated with a frantic, methodical brutality. The doctor was not merely seeking to restart a stopped heart. He was attempting to force life back into tissue that had already begun the irreversible slide into biological decay. His method relied on a dual assault of chemical perfusion and high-voltage galvanism. Becker had designed a massive mechanical apparatus composed of calibrated glass cylinders, brass stopcocks, and interconnected rubber hoses suspended above an enameled iron operating table. When a body was wheeled into the room, Becker would immediately incise the carotid and femoral arteries, draining the stagnant, venous blood and replacing it with a proprietary cocktail he termed the vitalizer solution. This fluid, mixed under Becker's paranoid supervision, was composed of hyper-oxygenated bovine blood serum, high concentrations of synthetic adrenaline, dissolved camphor, strychnine, and complex alkaline buffers intended to neutralize the lactic acid saturating the dead musculature. The perfusion pumps hissed and clacked with rhythmic precision, forcing liters of the heated, bright scarlet fluid into the vascular network until the pale, graying skin of the corpses flushed with an unnatural, blotchy pink hue. Then came the electrical assault. Becker clamped wide brass electrodes, wrapped in saline-soaked sponge, directly to the temples, the nape of the neck, and the bare chest directly over the cardiac apex. Standing before a wall-mounted marble switchboard, his eyes sunken and feverish behind round spectacles, Becker would throw the heavy knife switches. A deafening hum would tear through the basement as the induction coils discharged their stored current. The corpses on the iron table arched violently, their spines curving off the cold metal with sickening cracks as the involuntary electrical stimulation seized their motor nerves. Limbs jerked in terrifying, spasmodic imitation of conscious motion. Unseeing eyes snapped open beneath the glare of filament bulbs. Entrapped air in the dead lungs was expelled through vocal cords with wet, rattling gasps that sounded like agonized whispers in the damp room. Becker stood over them with a monaural wooden stethoscope pressed hard against cold ribs, listening desperately for the self-sustaining flutter of an independent pulse, his hand furiously adjusting rheostats and shouting instructions to Maria, who transcribed the voltage levels, perfusion temperatures, and physiological reactions in thick, leather-bound ledgers. Yet, despite the violent twitches and the brief, artificial flushes of warmth, true life remained stubbornly beyond Becker's reach. Within hours of the electrical cessation, the simulated vitality inevitably collapsed. The synthetic solutions leaked from damaged capillaries, tissues softened into rapid decomposition, and the bodies had to be hastily transferred to a secondary cellar where Becker had installed a small, unvented kerosene furnace to incinerate biological waste in secret. The doctor's failures did not temper his ambition, they accelerated his obsession. He became convinced that the flaw lay not in his chemical formula or the electrical current, but in the quality of the specimens. He argued bitterly with Maria that morgue cadavers and long-dead paupers were biologically compromised, their neural pathways already irreversibly degraded by hours of cellular starvation. To achieve full, conscious reanimation, he needed a pristine subject, a body delivered within the precise, narrow window of early biological death, intact, undamaged by chronic disease or the ravages of war. and maintained at a controlled temperature from the moment of clinical cessation. While Becker descended deeper into his manic isolation, the world outside the Waldhaus gates was beginning to turn against him. Whispers of the strange nocturnal deliveries and the constant, unnatural drone of the basement generators had filtered from the rural fringes into the bustling avenues of Berlin. The Berlin Medical Board, composed of conservative Prussian clinicians and university professors, had already begun an informal inquiry, denouncing Becker in medical journals as a charlatan, an unhinged necromancer, and a predatory ghoul preying on the mass bereavement of a defeated nation. The matter soon crossed from professional scandal into criminal jurisdiction. At the Central Police Presidium on Alexanderplatz, the mounting file of complaints landed on the desk of Inspector Wilhelm Gross. Gross was a veteran criminal investigator, a stoic and observant man who had spent decades navigating the shifting, turbulent underbelly of the capital. He was not a man given to sensationalism or metaphysical superstition. To Gross, the world was governed by material evidence, motive, and the law. Over the course of several weeks, Gross interviewed dozens of frantic citizens who had fallen into the Becker's orbit. There were working-class mothers who had given their life savings and the bodies of their influenza-stricken sons to Maria Becker, only to be turned away from the Waldhaus gates by armed guards when they begged to see their children. There were undertakers who reported that graves had been purchased but never filled, and pharmacists who came forward with alarming records showing that Becker was purchasing lethal quantities of adrenaline, strychnine, and industrial solvents through fraudulent medical dispensaries. Gross recognized the pattern immediately. It was a grotesque convergence of financial extortion, grave desecration, and illegal human experimentation carried out under the guise of revolutionary science. The inspector drafted preliminary charges of fraud and violation of public health statutes, but the legal framework of the Weimar Republic was fragile and convoluted. Becker was a fully credentialed medical doctor operating on private, heavily guarded property, shielded by the ironclad contracts signed by his patrons and the quiet, behind-the-scenes influence of wealthy elites who still clung to the belief that the physician might truly possess the key to conquering the grave. Gross needed undeniable, direct evidence of an active crime occurring within the walls of the manor before the magistrates would grant a full warrant to breach the estate. The catalyst that would bring Gross's investigation to a boiling point arrived in late October of 1921, in the form of Helena von Stauffer. Helena was the widow of a decorated imperial cavalry commander, residing in a cavernous, dark timbered villa in the affluent tier of western Berlin. Her entire existence had been consumed by the sudden, catastrophic loss of her only surviving child, an unmarried 22-year-old daughter who had collapsed and died of acute heart failure following a brief, violent fever. Unwilling to accept the finality of the diagnosis, and driven to near madness by the silence of her empty home, Helena had refused to allow the undertakers to inter the remains. Having heard the clandestine rumors circulating among Berlin's high society regarding Becker's miraculous work, she contacted Maria Becker in a state of absolute, unhinged grief. On a freezing, rain-swept midnight, an enclosed, silk-lined carriage escorted by two private outriders pulled up to the rusted gates of the Waldhaus. Inside the carriage, packed in zinc troughs filled with crushed ice and wrapped in linen shrouds, lay the pristine, unembalmed body of the young von Stauffer woman. The gates swung open, swallowing the carriage into the dark shadows of the pine trees. In the grand, peeling receiving hall of the manor, illuminated only by a pair of flickering candelabras, Helena von Stauffer met with Friedrich Becker. The doctor, his white coat stained and his eyes burning with an intense, unblinking fanaticism, looked upon the deceased daughter not with sorrow, but with the ravenous triumph of a man who had finally been handed the missing instrument of his destiny. A contract of unprecedented magnitude was signed on the heavy oak table. Helena surrendered a vast fortune in gold-backed bonds, accompanied by a single, unyielding demand. The procedure must be carried out in total, inviolable isolation behind locked doors, and she was not to be disturbed until her daughter was brought back up the basement stairs, breathing and conscious. Becker locked the heavy, iron-reinforced doors of the surgical theater behind him. The generator outside roared to a deafening pitch, sending vibrations shuddering through the damp masonry of the house, and the glass perfusion columns began to fill with the scarlet vitalizer fluid. The ultimate experiment had begun, completely cut off from the eyes of the world, while through the rain-soaked woods, Inspector Wilhelm Gross and a squad of armed city detectives were already closing in. The Brandenburg pine forests were shrouded in an impenetrable, freezing mist as the Waldhaus manor descended into its final, catastrophic 48 hours. Outside the perimeter, hired men in heavy, waterlogged greatcoats paced the iron fencing with loaded carbines, their breath crystallizing in the autumnal chill. Under their boots, the damp soil hummed with a low, continuous vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the estate. Deep beneath the manor's foundations, the heavy industrial dynamos were operating at maximum capacity, churning plumes of black, greasy coal smoke into the canopy of weeping trees. Within the walls of the estate, time lost all conventional meaning, measured only by the rhythmic thumping of the mechanical pumps and the erratic, blue-white flickering of electrical discharges bleeding through the basement floorboards. In the cavernous upper salon, Helena von Stauffer sat immobilized by grief and terror, wrapped in black mourning silks that rustled against the worn velvet of a high-backed armchair. A single silver carriage clock on the mantelpiece ticked relentlessly toward the 40-hour mark of the contracted operation. She had not slept, nor had she touched the tea that Maria Becker brought to her at rigid intervals. Helena's eyes, bruised by days of weeping, remained fixed upon the heavy, iron-strapped oak door at the end of the hall, the threshold leading down into the subterranean surgical wing. Whenever the generator's pitch spiked, causing the crystal prisms of the chandelier above her to shiver and sing, the grieving mother would press her knuckles against her mouth to stifle a scream. Maria Becker stood by the rain-streaked window like an unblinking sentinel, her fingers nervously pleating her white apron, assuring the wealthy widow with a steady, clinical voice that the biological equilibrium was merely stabilizing and that the delay was standard for a complete vascular revitalization. Yet beneath that practiced composure, the atmosphere inside the manor was disintegrating into panic. The acrid stench of scorched rubber, evaporated carbolic acid, and heated copper had seeped up from the basement, filling the hallways with a choking, chemical haze that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat with the metallic taste of ozone. From behind the locked iron door, muffled sounds drifted upward, the violent hiss of high-pressure steam valves, the rhythmic clanking of glass perfusion chambers, and occasional, unintelligible shouting from Friedrich Becker. His voice, hoarse and strained to the point of breaking, rose and fell in furious cadence alongside the whine of the galvanic coils. He was talking to someone or something, hurling anatomical commands into the subterranean gloom as though bargaining with death itself. As the 44th hour struck in the dead of night, the physical disturbances reached an unbearable crescendo. A sudden, violent power surge tore through the estate's electrical grid, blowing out every incandescent bulb on the ground floor in a synchronized shower of sparks. In the sudden, pitch-black darkness, a sound reverberated from the depths of the basement that caused Helena von Stauffer to bolt from her chair, a wet, concussive crash followed by the distinct, frantic ringing of an iron instrument tray tumbling across a stone floor. Then, through the silence that followed the sudden stalling of the main engine, came a human shriek, raw, animalistic, and utterly unhinged. Helena could no longer be contained. Tearing herself away from Maria Becker's restraining hands, the mother lunged across the hall and hurled her entire weight against the reinforced basement door, beating the blackened wood with her bare fists until the skin across her knuckles split. She screamed her daughter's name into the keyhole, demanding that the locks be drawn, demanding to see the revived flesh of her child. Maria, her facade of icy professional authority shattered, rushed to the iron gate at the front entrance, attempting to signal the perimeter guards. She was met not by her hired men, but by the blinding glare of carbide searchlights slicing through the mist. Inspector Wilhelm Gross had arrived, having secured an emergency judicial intervention order from the district magistrate after intercepting a frantic telegram regarding the delivery of the von Stauffer remains. Gross led a squad of 12 armed city constables and forensic specialists across the muddy lawn. The private mercenaries, already unnerved by the ungodly noises and the stench radiating from the cellar, threw down their weapons without firing a single shot. Gross kicked open the manor's heavy front doors, his service revolver drawn, followed closely by detectives carrying iron crowbars, axes, and lanterns. The scene in the foyer was bedlam. Helena von Stauffer was collapsed against the basement threshold, sobbing hysterically and clawing at the iron hinges, while Maria Becker stood pinned against the wall by two constables, her lips moving in silent, disjointed prayers. Gross wasted no time on protocol. He grabbed the heavy iron ring of the basement door and found it bolted from the inside by 3 massive sliding tumblers. The inspector motioned for his men with the sledgehammers to advance. The concussive thuds of steel striking seasoned oak shook the hallway, the sound echoing like cannon fire through the hollow house. Splinters flew with every blow. With a final, agonizing groan of tearing metal, the lock mounting sheared away, and the heavy door gave way inward, swinging back into the dark mouth of the stairwell. A wall of thick, sickening vapor rolled up the stone steps, carrying the suffocating smell of burnt animal tissue, concentrated vinegar, stale blood, and overheated electrical wiring. Gross drew a handkerchief over his nose and mouth, raised his lantern, and descended the spiral staircase, his boots slipping on a viscous, oily condensation that coated the flagstones. The subterranean surgical theater was a scene of total industrial ruin. Massive glass carboys of red perfusion fluid lay shattered across the floor, their toxic contents pooling in the central drainage gullies where they mixed with crushed ice and battery acid. Heavy copper cables, severed and still spitting dying blue sparks, hung from the vaulted brick ceiling like mutilated vines. The twin galvanic induction machines stood cracked and smoking, their brass dials warped from extreme thermal overload. In the far corner of the chamber, wedged between an overturned oxygen cylinder and a ruined chemical balance, sat Dr. Friedrich Becker. The physician was in a state of absolute psychological collapse. His white surgical coat was torn open at the chest, heavily soaked in dark fluid, and his hands were shredded and blackened with carbon burns. He was rocking back and forth on his haunches, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and unblinking, staring blankly at the floor. When Gross approached him, gun drawn, Becker did not flinch. He merely curled his fingers into the chemical slurry on the floor and began muttering in a broken, raspy whisper, repeating over and over that the pulse had caught, that the current had held, that the blood had begun to sing in the vessels. Gross lowered his weapon and turned toward the center of the room. Under the glare of the shattered overhead surgical lamp stood the galvanized steel operating table. It was completely empty. The heavy leather restraint straps, designed to hold the limbs of an experimental subject, had been violently unbuckled or torn from their brass rivets. Thick smears of crimson perfuasate and thawed brine marked the cold metal slab, trailing down the pedestal and leading toward the back of the room. Gross and his detectives frantically searched every square inch of the vault. They tore open the zinc-cold storage lockers, inspected the coal-fired incinerator which was cold and choked with undisturbed cobwebs, and smashed open the iron grates of the subterranean runoff drains. They probed the narrow, iron-barred cellar windows that sat near the ceiling, but found every rusted bar intact, firmly set into the ancient lime mortar, impossible for any human form to pass through. There was no body. There was no trace of the young von Stauffer woman's remains. No clothing, no shroud, and no evidence that an exit had ever been breached from the inside. When Helena von Stauffer was helped down the stairs, supported by 2 constables, her eyes fell upon the bare, glistening metal of the vacant operating table. A single, piercing wail tore from her throat before she collapsed unconscious onto the wet flagstones. Gross stood amidst the smoking wreckage of the laboratory, the beam of his lantern illuminating the empty table and the broken, babbling physician in the corner. In that suffocating cellar beneath the pines of Brandenburg, the boundary between an audacious medical fraud and an inexplicable horror had completely vanished, leaving behind only the cold, impenetrable mystery of a patient who had entered the room a corpse, and left no earthly trace behind. The pale, cold dawn that rose over the pine forests of Brandenburg brought no clarity, only the stark illumination of a landscape transformed into a crime scene. As the autumn mist clung to the damp earth, dozens of additional constables from the Berlin Criminal Police arrived by open-top lorries, their heavy boots churning the gravel driveways into gray mud. Inspector Wilhelm Gross did not sleep. With his overcoat collar turned up against the biting wind, he directed an exhaustive, systematic forensic sweep of the entire estate, determined to solve the impossible riddle of the subterranean vault. Every square yard of the Becker property was subjected to brutal physical scrutiny. Teams of laborers armed with shovels and trenching spades dug exploratory trenches through the manicured rose gardens, the untamed orchard, and the perimeter fence line, hunting for freshly turned soil or clandestine graves. Handlers with bloodhounds circled the brick foundations, but the dogs grew frantic and confused, sneezing violently as their nostrils were overwhelmed by the lingering chemical miasma of carbolic acid, ammonia, and sulfur that drifted from the laboratory ventilation shafts. Specialist search teams descended into the estate's underground infrastructure. They crawled through the narrow, brick-lined drainage channels, following the foul runoff pipes to their outlet in a nearby peat marsh. Every cesspool was drained, every septic tank dredged with iron hooks, and every water cistern illuminated by magnesium flares. Forensic chemists collected samples from the silt, looking for bone fragments, dental enamel, or concentrated lye solutions that might indicate the chemical liquefaction of a human corpse. They found nothing. There was no physical residue of the von Stauffer woman's body, no scrap of torn shroud, no discarded surgical ligature. The iron bars over the cellar's high windows remained undisturbed in their stone sockets, their decades-old crust of lime mortar uncracked. It was as though a fully grown adult corpse had simply dissolved into the damp air of the cellar. In the upper rooms of the manor, Maria Becker was subjected to hours of rigorous interrogation. Stripped of her ledger books and the thick stacks of correspondence from desperate, grieving families, she sat beneath the sharp glare of an inspector's lamp, her expression hardened into a mask of defiant exhaustion. She offered no confessions, no explanations of secret passageways, and no admissions of a confidence trick. When pressed by Gross about the fate of the girl on the table, she merely stared at her trembling hands and whispered that science had done what science was summoned to do, and that whatever had crossed the threshold of life had departed by its own volition. By the spring of 1922, the quiet terror of the Brandenburg Clinic was transferred to the grand, echoing chambers of the Moabite Criminal Court in Berlin. The trial of Dr. Friedrich Becker became an absolute media sensation, drawing hundreds of spectators who queued through the freezing night outside the courthouse just to secure a seat in the public gallery. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was thick with the scent of damp wool overcoats, cheap tobacco, and the ozone tang of magnesium flash powder from newspaper photographers. For a society still deeply scarred by the cataclysm of the Great War and the phantom grief of the influenza epidemic, the proceedings were not merely a trial of one man. They were a macabre referendum on the limits of science, mortality, and collective madness. The prosecution, led by state attorneys who worked hand-in-hand with Inspector Gross, sought to dismantle Becker's mystique and present him as a ruthless charlatan who preyed upon the sacred agony of the bereaved. They brought forward towering stacks of financial ledgers demonstrating that Becker had extracted millions of paper marks, fortunes rendered volatile by Weimar inflation from families desperate for a miracle. Pathologists from the Charité hospital took the stand to testify against Becker, declaring his galvanic theories to be biological impossibilities. They argued that once irreversible cellular necrosis had set in, no arrangement of electrical currents or chemical perfusates could restore metabolic function, let alone conscious life. Yet the central legal paradox of the trial continuously threatened to collapse the prosecution's case: the complete absence of a corpus delicti. Under German criminal jurisprudence, convicting a man of murder, manslaughter, or even the illegal disposal of a corpse required tangible proof of the body's destruction or concealment. The defense exploited this void mercilessly. Becker's lawyers argued that if the state could not produce the remains of the von Stauffer daughter, it could not prove she had been murdered, mutilated, or destroyed. They even posited, in front of an electrified courtroom, the outrageous proposition that the medical board could not disprove the doctor's claim. That the patient had indeed revived and wandered away into the night while the physician lay incapacitated by an electrical shock. Helena von Stauffer was called to testify, appearing before the bench dressed in heavy mourning crepe, supported on either side by family attendants. Her testimony was a harrowing descent into maternal anguish. She recounted the sleepless months following her daughter's initial death, the seductive, articulate promises whispered by Becker in his parlor, and the terrifying descent into the smoking cellar where she found only an empty metal slab. Her voice broke as she demanded to know whether her child was resting in an unmarked ditch or wandering the woods as a biological monstrosity. The grief in the room was suffocating, a physical weight that silenced even the most cynical journalists. Throughout the weeks of grueling testimony, Dr. Friedrich Becker sat in the prisoner's dock, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and visibly aged. The severe burns on his hands had healed into thick, shiny keloid scars, but his psychological deterioration was absolute. He refused to adopt the posture of a remorseful swindler. Whenever he was given the floor, he erupted into passionate, disjointed discourses on galvanic induction, cellular resuscitation, and the failure of mainstream medicine to recognize that death was merely a mechanical stoppage awaiting a sufficiently powerful spark. He insisted, with frantic, unblinking intensity, that the monitors had registered a heartbeat, that the blue tinge of the girl's skin had turned to flush rose, and that her eyes had fluttered open before the generator exploded and threw him into darkness. He maintained that he had succeeded, and that the authorities, in their crude, violent raid, had disrupted the delicate recovery and allowed a revived, disoriented human being to vanish into the night. In late 1922, the court delivered its verdict. Unable to charge Becker with murder due to the lack of physical remains, the judges convicted him on multiple counts of aggravated fraud, gross extortion under false pretenses, extensive grave desecration, and egregious violations of the imperial public health laws. He was sentenced to the maximum term of imprisonment at hard labor, and the state medical board permanently revoked his license to practice medicine, striking his name from the registry in disgrace. Maria Becker received a lesser sentence as an accomplice to financial fraud, her role in the administrative deception firmly established. Yet the conclusion of the legal proceedings did nothing to dissipate the haunting mystery of the estate. Following his eventual release from prison years later, Becker lived as a ruined, reclusive outcast on the fringes of Berlin. He never returned to conventional society, nor did he ever recant his claims. Until his death in the mid-20th century, he lived in squalid rooms cluttered with hand-drawn circuit diagrams, physiological treatises, and jars of chemical salts, constantly writing letters to scientific academies demanding a vindication that never came. He died penniless, still maintaining to his final breath that on that freezing night in 1921, the von Stauffer girl had drawn breath. The estate outside Berlin was eventually demolished, its cellars filled with rubble and overgrown by the encroaching pines, but the case etched itself deeply into the dark folklore of the Weimar era. It became a terrifying emblem of a broken nation's vulnerability, a historical moment when the sheer scale of mass death had so violently ruptured the collective human psyche that even the impossible seemed plausible. The empty steel operating table beneath the ruins of the laboratory remained a permanent monument to that desperation. A void that could never be filled, standing between the arrogance of unbridled human ambition and the eternal silence of the grave.